The year 1968. The USSR has just unveiled their brand new top-of-the-line fighter jet, the MiG-25, capable of higher altitudes, higher speeds, vastly more maneuverable, and just generally more liked by its pilots when compared to its American counterpart, the F-4 Phantom, which you find out about in its whole own mega projects video after you've watched this one, of course. It has the US Air Force shaking in their boots. To make matters worse, the US has been bogged down in the Vietnam War for nearly 10 years, losing over 200 F-4s in that time and going on to lose another 300 before it would be done. The US needed a hero, and in late 1972 that hero would come. A fighter jet so successful that not only has one never been lost to an aerial combatant, but it is still in service over 50 years from first flying. The focus of today's Mega Projects video is, of course, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, the greatest fighter jet of all time. The story of the F-15 begins, like all things, in the deep depths of American bureaucracy. Then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was desperately looking for ways to cut back the costs of the bloated US military. The public had begun to turn against the Vietnam War, and as such, the blank check budget could no longer be supported. This ultimately led to his fateful decision in 1965 that the US Air Force and Navy would be pushed to adopt a single standardized jet for fighter missions, another for bombing missions, and a third for surveillance. Aimed primarily at cutting costs, this decision has been credited as leading to the development of the F-11 Aardvark long-range interdiction fighter and the F-4 Phantom strike fighter. Each, although capable jets, would receive a large matter of criticism in their own right. The F-11 criticized for lacking sufficient capacity to carry heavy loads, and the F-4 being criticized for being too slow and hard to maneuver, particularly at low altitudes, such as the altitudes where most dogfights in Vietnam actually occurred. This ultimately led to the US DoD publishing a call for designs in 1968. This call required that any designs be capable of Mach 2.5, to be easily maneuverable at all altitudes, and to burn less fuel than any previous jet that had been used by the US. This call, coming just weeks after the MiG-25's unveiling, was a clear attempt by the US at military one-upmanship, one that they would handily deliver on. The Department of Defense would receive 4 designs, one each from General Dynamics, Fairchild Republic, North American Rockwell, and McDonnell Douglas. Ultimately, it was decided that the best aircraft to improve on the flaws of the F-4 would be the one designed by the F-4's creator, and as such, in June 1969, McDonnell Douglas was granted the contract and the F-15 was born. There are 7 primary variants of the F-15, the A, B, C, D, E, 2, and X. The A and B models were the very first models introduced in July of 1972 and 1973, respectively. The only notable difference between the two jets being that A was a single-seater and B a dual-seater. This design decision was specifically so that the B could compete better with the F-4, a major selling point of which was that it was one of the first ever jets to be dual-seater by design, which allowed one pilot to focus on actually flying the jet and a second to focus on target acquisition and communicating with Air Command. A second clear advantage that the A and B had over their competitors was the inclusion of groundbreaking shoot-down radar. This module had been specifically designed by McDonnell Douglas to overcome the key issue that had been faced by US fighter jets in Vietnam. In Vietnam, many F-4 pilots often had to resort to minigun kills due to a claimed inability of their jets to actually secure radar locks on enemy MiGs. This primarily arose due to the MiG's tendency to fly at exceedingly low altitude, barely above the treetops, and as a result, the trees would interfere with the previous radar far too much. McDonnell Douglas claimed that their brand new radar had completely overcome the issue faced by the F-4 and that it should be fully capable of securing a lock at low altitude. On proof of this claim being supplied, McDonnell was immediately greeted with an order for over 500 F-15A and Bs for immediate use. Although the Vietnam War would end in 1975, meaning that only a very small number of the early aircraft would actually see combat in this theater. This early success did not stymie development at McDonnell Douglas, though. Only a few years later, in 1978, the first major improvement would be made to the F-15 range with the release of the F-15C and D. These aircraft would go on to be the most mass-produced version of the F-15, and although not still in service in the US Air Force, they are still one of the most widely used jets of all time. Like their predecessors, the C and D's only difference with one another is that the C is a single-seater and the D is a dual-seater. The new model did present 4 major improvements over the previous generation, though. Firstly, the new aircraft could carry a drastically higher amount of fuel, both internally and externally. This allowed for not just longer-range missions, but crucially, it allowed for longer times in the air. Yet another complaint that had been raised in the Vietnam War was that F-4s had a small fuel tank. This had often meant that as soon as an F-4 was heard overhead, any Viet Cong fighters would simply lay low and just wait it out. This was no longer a possibility with the F-15. The second major advantage of the new aircraft was the equally drastic increase in maximum flight weight. The new models could carry up to 61,000 pounds at takeoff, compared with the A and B's capacity of only 40,000 pounds. This enabled not just an even greater increase for fuel capacity, but a vast increase in the number of armaments that the new jets could carry, now being capable of carrying up to 16 different air-to-air missiles at a time, as well as carrying a single 20mm M61A1 Vulcan rotary cannon in the nose. The third major advantage of the C&D was that not only was it capable of carrying more missiles, but it could carry better missiles. The F-15's onboard central computer came with built-in support for the brand new AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, and the brand new long-range AIM-120 AMRAAM Fire and Forget air-to-air missile. This final missile was capable of not just engaging targets beyond the line of sight of the pilot, but even capable of maintaining a lock even if the F-15 had lost it. This was a revolutionary weapon and made the F-15 C&D the most advanced fighter jets of their time. The final major improvement over the A and B was the inclusion of the world's first programmable signal processor, or PSP radar. This radar allowed the pilot or co-pilot in an F-15D to reprogram the radar mid-flight. This could prove particularly useful if the jet needed to be retasked to deal with ground targets or helicopters, or if the jet that the F-15 was engaging with was deploying countermeasures, in which case the PSP could even be used to overcome them. Ultimately, PSP radar would revolutionize the development of fighter jets and would bring the F-15 one step closer to replacing the F-4 as a multi-purpose strike fighter. Ultimately, the final nail in the F-4's coffin would come in 1982 with the release of the F-15E. The E had been produced as part of a new call for specification issued by the Department of Defense aimed at providing both the Air Force and the Navy with a single strike fighter capable of engaging both enemy air targets and ground targets. It had been specifically designed to be capable of supporting both a ground-focused and air-focused radar, making it a true jack of all trades. The combination of its PSP radar, dual-seater array, and a radar that was particularly skilled at differentiating between enemies and ground interference made it perfectly suited for this role. The key difference between the E and earlier models was further refined with its fuel tank and trimming off some extra weight. This enabled the E to have a slightly lower weight than its predecessors, while crucially not cutting down drastically on either viable flight times or effective combat range. The second major difference of the E was that alongside the air-to-air missiles the C and D supported, it also supported an array of air-to-surface missiles, as well as both guided and unguided bombs, including nuclear munitions. The E ultimately revolutionized the role of the F-15. No longer did strike fighters need to sacrifice their speed for effective ground support. Not only that, but the E introduced a challenge for opponents of the USA. If an E was spotted on radar, there was no way of knowing whether it was prepped for air-to-air or air-to-ground or a mixed load. This lack of predictability has been cited by many military planners as a key reason in the E being such an effective jet, and one of the reasons that it is the last of the classic F-15 models to still be employed by the US military. The E would be the last upgrade to the F-15 line for just over 30 years, until in 2013, Boeing, who now owns McDonnell Douglas, announced a new upgrade program for the entire fleet of C&Ds, this upgrade being termed the F-15-2s. This new upgrade was primarily aimed to fill a hole left in the air fleets by the delay of the new F-22s, which you can learn also more about in their entire own megaprojects video. Nothing detailed is really known about the F-15-2s, at least nothing for sure. What we do know is that they are faster, have a longer range, and can carry more advanced weapons than their predecessors. The 2 is not the only new F-15 though. In 2021, a whopping 50 years after the first test flight of an F-15, Boeing would announce the F-15EX. The EX is just as secretive as the 2s about its exact exact details, but it has been rumored to be capable of nearly 3 times the speed of sound, which would make it far and away the single fastest fighter jet in the world. It's also known that the price of these new jets is about $150 million. Despite going 50 years in the front seat, Boeing has showed no signs of slowing. It's rumored that even more variants of the F-15 will be announced over the coming years, and in recent press releases, they've even claimed that the F-15 will be kept as an airworthy fighter jet until the mid-2050s, which would make the F-15 90 if it really does reach that aim. The first F-15 delivered to the US Air Force was an F-15B delivered on the 13th of November 1974. The first combat deployment would come in January 1976 as part of the 555th Fighter Squadron, and it has seen service in 7 countries. Notably, the F-15 is one of the few US fighters not operated by the United Kingdom, thanks to the fact that it directly competes with the UK's own Eurofighter Typhoon. The first kill ever scored by the F-15 would be against a Jordanian MiG-25 in 1979 in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israeli combat ace Moshe Malnik scored the kill. In fact, the Israeli Air Force would go on to shoot down more jets with the F-15 than all the other countries combined, shooting down over 60 different jets without suffering a single loss. Then from 1984 to 1988, the US Air Force wondered what they could do with their most versatile jet, to which they had the response that all of us would have with our multi-million-dollar jet machine: let's take it to space. The F-15 would become the aircraft of choice for the ASAT program, a program designed specifically to counter Soviet spy satellites. As part of the program, US pilots would fly to the uppermost edges of the atmosphere, equipped with experimental AIM-135 long-range air-to-air missiles. Once there, they would see whether they could engage a radar lock with a satellite in low Earth orbit and then attempt to shoot it down. For the most part, this program was a complete failure. The missiles rarely managed to hit their target, and the entire program was causing quite a political mess due to the various treaties prohibiting the militarization of outer space. Despite ASAT's canning in 1988, it would be an F-15A piloted by Major Doug Pearson, which would become the only jet in human history to ever shoot down a satellite successfully. From there, the next deployment of the F-15 would be as part of Operation Desert Shield, and then later in the subsequent Operation Desert Storm, operated by both the United States and Saudi Arabia in the conflict. The F-15 would be deployed for 2 primary duties. Firstly, it would be tasked with establishing air superiority over the region, something it had been widely credited with achieving, having scored 36 out of the 39 air victories scored by the US in that conflict. Secondly, it would be tasked, in conjunction with ground spotting teams from the British SAS, with destroying the deadly Scud missiles which were scattered across the Iraqi desert. In this, it also proved deadly efficient. As its ultimate testament, across the entire Gulf War, only 2 F-15s would be lost, both to ground fire. The final major engagement of the late 20th century would come in 1999 with Operation Allied Force, where NATO deployed its forces to support a no-fly zone which had been declared above the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo. In this conflict, F-15s would be credited with grounding almost the entire Yugoslav Air Force after the destruction on one day of 4 of their MiG-29s, their most advanced jets. As figures published in 2008 by the US Department of Defense, F-15s worldwide have been credited with 104 air-to-air kills, compared with absolutely 0 losses to air targets. This is already impressive, but when compared with the F-4, which lost over 500 jets in Vietnam alone, this really does outline the F-15 as one of the most remarkably efficient jets of all time. From 2000 to 2010, the US would begin to decommission much of its older F-15C and F-15D fleets, replacing them with either newly upgraded F-15-2s or F-22 fighters where available. This has not ended the use of the F-15 worldwide, though. The jet is still used by both the Israeli Air Force and the Saudi Royal Air Force. Most notably, the Saudis have deployed dozens of F-15s to devastate the Yemeni Air Force and have used the jet in Yemen as recently as 2021. But there is one conflict that has dominated headlines throughout late 2022 and into 2023, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, crossing Ukraine's eastern and northern borders while also launching an attack out of occupied Crimea. Immediately before this advance, there was a catastrophic air bombardment of Ukraine, primarily by cruise missiles, but also by the limited use of both Russian helicopters and jet aircraft. Observers at the time of the invasion believed that the war would be short and probably bloody, clearly leaning in Russia's favor. Since then, Ukraine has not only managed to hold on for a year, but they have proven themselves equally capable of striking Russia where it hurts. A key part of the war in Ukraine has been the Western assistance of the country by supplying arms. One such arm that Ukraine has frequently requested is the F15. Now, at the time of the writing of this script, it was believed by most observers that Ukraine had about the same chance of getting an F15 as winning the lottery, which is to say not very much. Since that early writing, the United States has actually announced that they're going to be sending the top-of-the-line M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, something that was also believed to be very unlikely. So, providing that by the time this video comes out, F-15s haven't already been sent, it now does seem like a possibility that F-15s may soon be flying in the skies above Ukraine. From pilots beleaguered by the aging and sluggish F4 to the always grinning face of Tom Cruise in Top Gun to potentially the need in the Ukrainian Air Force, the F-15 has been a constant force for pure military power in the skies of conflict zones for the past 50 years. There's no sign it plans to slow down anytime soon. And with a record of 104-0, why would they?